Hello kids, we have a very interesting story today, and this story is about true events. So the title of the story is My Tryst with Everest. Tryst meaning meeting. I got up at 4 in the morning, melted snow and brewed tea. After a light breakfast of a few biscuits and half a slab of chocolate, I left my tent at around 5:30 a.m. Ang Dorji was standing outside. No one else was about. सुबह सुबह अपने टेंट से निकलना था, तो तैयार जल्दी हो गए. Ang Dorji was going to climb without oxygen, but because of this, his feet would get very cold. He thus wanted to avoid long exposure at heights and a night at the summit camp. He had therefore to either get back to the peak and back to the South Pole the same day or abandon the attempt. समझ गए ना आप? माउंट एवरेस्ट पे चढ़ाई करनी है किन्होंने? इन्होंने. इनका नाम भी अभी बताएंगे. और इनके साथ जाना था एंग शेरपा ने. जो एंग दौरजी जो शेरपा थे, उन्होंने बिना ऑक्सीजन के जाना था, जिससे उनके पैर बहुत ज़्यादा ठंडे हो जाते. तो उनकी कोशिश थी कि जिस सुबह जाएं उसी दिन वापस आ जाएं. ऐसा हुआ क्या? लेट्स रीड फर्दर. He was keen to start immediately and asked if I would like to go with him. Going to the top from the South Pole and back in a day would be strenuous and tough, and there was the risk of Ang Dorji turning back if his feet got too cold. I, however, had full confidence in Ang Dorji as well as in my stamina and climbing capability. Besides, no one else was ready to move at that time. ध्यान है ना, सुबह के 5:30 बजे इन लोगों ने चढ़ाई शुरू करनी है. And she is ready. At 6:20, when Ang Dorji and I stepped out from the South Pole, it was a perfect day. There was a gentle breeze, but the cold was intense. I was, however, warm in my well-insulated climbing gear. We climbed unroped. Ang Dorji set a steady pace, but I had no difficulty keeping up with him. याद है ना कि इनका स्टैमिना भी अच्छा है और इनकी क्लाइंबिंग कैपेबिलिटी भी अच्छी है, तो इनको कोई ज़्यादा प्रॉब्लम नहीं हुई स्टार्टिंग में. The steep frozen slopes were as hard and brittle as sheets of glass. बर्फ जब चिपक के जमनी शुरू होती है तो वो ग्लास की तरह हार्ड हो जाती है. We had to use the ice axe and I had to kick really hard to get the front teeth of the crampons to bite into the frozen surface. एक वो जो लंबी सी स्टिक आइस एक्स होती है, उसको ज़ोर से आइस में दबाना पड़ता था. और इन लोगों के शूज़ में आगे ना स्टील के छोटे छोटे स्पाइक्स कील टाइप होते हैं, जिससे कि ये अपनी पकड़ बना सकें आइस में. तो उसको भी जो लेखिका है बड़े ज़ोर से पैर अपना मारना पड़ता था ताकि वो स्पाइक्स आइस में जाएं. I took every step very deliberately on the dangerous stretches. In less than 2 hours, we reached the summit camp. Ang Dorji looked back and asked if I was tired. I replied no, to his surprise and delight. He told me that the earlier summit party had taken 4 hours to reach the summit camp and added that if we could keep our present pace, we would be on the summit by 1 p.m. दोपहर 1 बजे तक पहुंचने के चांसेस थे इनके. Latu was following us and caught up with us when we rested below the south summit. After drinking tea, we moved on. Latu was following us and caught up with us when we rested below the south summit. After drinking tea, we moved on. Latu had brought a nylon rope, so Ang Dorji and I roped up while Latu walked in the middle, holding the rope with one hand, more for balance than security. देख सकते हैं ना, तीनों लाइन में जा रहे हैं. Latu noticed that I had been climbing with oxygen at about 2.5 liters per minute against the normal 4 for these heights. After he increased the oxygen flow on my regulator, I found even the steeper stretches comparatively easy. Beyond the south summit, the breeze increased. At that height, the eddies of strong winds whipped up the powder snow, reducing visibility to nil. जब तेज़ हवा चल रही थी ज़्यादा हाइट पे, तो थोड़ी बहुत स्नो जो है ना वो उड़ उड़ के इनकी आँखों की तरफ आ रही थी. On many occasions, I had to get into a crouching position with my back to the onslaught of the icy wind, saturated with fine particles of bone-dry powder snow. बड़ी बार इनको विंड के अगेंस्ट अपनी पीठ करके थोड़ा सा क्राउच करना पड़ता था, बेंड करना पड़ता था, क्योंकि बहुत ही ज़्यादा ठंडी तो थी विंड, लेकिन उसके साथ पाउडरी स्नो भी बहुत ज़्यादा थी जो लग रही थी. Let's see what happens. It was terrifying to stand erect on a knife-edge ridge with a sheer drop on either side. अब ऐसी जगह खड़े थे, पतली सी जगह है जिसके दोनों तरफ बड़ी स्टीप सी खाई है. I had to dig my ice axe deep and secure myself by attaching the waist strap to the ice axe head. There was some tricky climbing between the south summit and what is popularly known as Hillary's Step. Ang Dorji and Latu were already over it, but I was still negotiating its vertical face when Ang Dorji gesticulated towards the top. Gesticulated मतलब हाथ से इशारा करना. I was thrilled. The goal was near. With renewed vigor, I was on top of the step in seconds. The sun had made the snow soft and climbing was easier here than it had been earlier. We trudged in the heavy powder snow for some time. Then the gradient started easing off noticeably. A few steps later, I saw that after only a couple of meters, there was no upward climb. The slope plunged steeply down. Gradient मतलब जो एक slope जा रही है ऊपर की तरफ. My heart stood still. It dawned on me that success was within reach. And at 1:07 p.m. on 23rd May 1984, I stood on top of Everest, the first Indian woman to have done so. There was hardly enough place for two to stand side by side on the top of the Everest cone. Thousands of meters of near vertical drop on all sides made safety our foremost consideration, and we first anchored ourselves securely by digging our ice axes into the snow. चारों तरफ इतनी स्टीप खाई थी कि ऑब्वियसली अपनी सेफ्टी पहली कंसिडरेशन थी, तो इसलिए अपने आइस एक्सेस को कस के स्नो में दबा रखा था सहारा लेने के लिए. That done, I sank on my knees and putting my forehead on the snow, kissed सागर मठा's crown. जो एवरेस्ट की पीक है उसका नाम सागर मठ है. Without getting up, I took out the image of Durga Ma and my Hanuman Chalisa from my rucksack. I wrapped it in a red cloth which I had brought, and after saying a short prayer, buried them in the snow. At this moment of joy, my thoughts went to my father and mother. As I rose, I folded my hands and bowed in respect to Ang Dorji, my rope leader, who had encouraged and led me to my goal. बहुत इम्पॉर्टेंट है, जो लोग आपको सक्सेसफुल बनाते हैं या आपके गोल तक ले जाने में हेल्प करते हैं, उनकी मेहनत ज़रूर एक्नॉलेज करनी चाहिए और उनको रिस्पेक्ट भी देनी चाहिए. I also congratulated him for his second ascent of Everest without oxygen. Ang Dorji की माउंट एवरेस्ट की ये दूसरी चढ़ाई थी जो कि बिना ऑक्सीजन के करी थी उन्होंने. He embraced me and whispered in my ear, "You climb good. Very happy, Didi." A little later, Sonam Pulsar arrived and began taking photographs. By then, Latu had given the news of the 4 atop Everest to our leader. The walkie-talkie was then passed on to me. Colonel Khullar was delighted with our success. After congratulating me, he said, "I would also like to congratulate your parents for your unique achievement." He added that the country was proud of me and that I would return to a world which would be quite different from the one I had left behind. जानते हैं क्यों? क्योंकि अब इंडिया की पहली वुमन माउंट एवरेस्ट चढ़ चुकी थी. We summiteers embraced and thumped one another's back. Summiteer मतलब जो लोग ऊपर चढ़ते हैं, यहाँ पे माउंट एवरेस्ट. Nepalese, Indian, and following my sake, the Seven Sisters and Tisco flags were hoisted and photographed. We spent 43 minutes on the summit. The towering giants Lhotse, Nuptsu and Makalu were dwarfed by our mountain. I collected a few samples of stone from a bare patch near the peak. Souvenir के लिए. We started our downhill journey at 1:55 p.m. I knew I would have to be specially careful during the return trip, for more accidents occurred on descending than when climbing up. Generally, नीचे उतरते टाइम ज़्यादा एक्सीडेंट्स होते हैं, तो ज़्यादा केयरफुल रहना पड़ता है. But I was unaware of one fundamental hazard. I took off my snow goggles on the snowless and dark rock patches, assuming that snow blindness was only caused by the glare of the sun's rays reflected from the snow, and besides the atmosphere was hazy. Generally क्या होता है कि जब आप स्नो क्लैड माउंटेन्स में जाते हैं तो जब सन की रेज स्नो पर पड़ती है और फिर आपकी आँखों पर आती है तो वो आपकी आँखों को हार्म कर सकती है. उसके लिए स्नो गॉगल्स पहनने पड़ते हैं. लेकिन ऐसा सिर्फ जहाँ पे बर्फ़ है वहीं के लिए नहीं है. स्नो ब्लाइंडनेस, however, is due to strong ultraviolet rays at high altitudes and has nothing to do with the snow or the glare. ज़रूरी नहीं कि स्नो हो तभी आपकी आइज़ में नुकसान पहुँचेगा. उतनी हाइट पर अल्ट्रावायलेट रेज जो हैं वो आपकी आँखों को नुकसान पहुँचाते हैं. I paid a heavy price following my ignorance. Both my eyes were affected and I suffered intense pain. On our return to the camp, I had to take a sleeping pill, the only one I had during my stay on Everest. Though Ang Dorji moved fast, I found I was reasonably sure-footed in downhill climbing, even at the veteran Sherpa's pace. हालांकि एंग दौरजी बड़ी बार ऊपर जाके आ चुके थे, लेकिन जो ये पहली बार गई थी, इनके लिए भी कुछ ज़्यादा मुश्किल नहीं था. When we were still some distance from the south col, to my astonishment, I saw Magan Bissa coming up. It was dangerous to be on the exposed southeast ridge in the evening when the temperature dropped sharply, besides the usual dangers of height and environment. Bissa's rucksack was filled with oxygen cylinders and thermos flasks. He congratulated us and gave us some hot drinks and juice. Then he went up to help Latu and Pulsar and gave them hot drinks. Pulsar had no oxygen mask, so Bissa gave him his own. Latu reached the south col at 6 p.m. when Bissa brought Pulsar to safety on his rope at 7 p.m. Ang Dorji and I had arrived at the south col at 5 p.m. Everyone complimented us for doing the South Col Summit South Col trip in only 10 hours 40 minutes, including the halt at the top. As I was entering my tent, I overheard Major Kumar talking to Colonel Khullar on the wireless. "Believe it or not, sir," he said excitedly, "Bachendri is already back in just 3 hours. And she looks as fresh as she was when she started climbing up this mountain." अब आप जान गए ना ये किनकी कहानी है? बचेंद्री पाल, इंडिया की पहली वुमन क्लाइंबर जिन्होंने माउंट एवरेस्ट क्लाइंब किया था।